The hallway of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, a place nicknamed the Justice of the United States, had lawyers whispering their schemes, but no one drew more attention than Officer Mark Thornton. He was big, coarse, moving with the weight of a bear on the hunt. The sound of his studded boots striking the marble floor rang out harshly, as if he wanted to crush anything that stood in his way. Mark was in a hurry. He needed to finish off the fate of a homeless man in the upcoming trial. To him, this wasn't justice, it was a ticket to promotion. But Mark wasn't the only creature in that hallway. Hiding in a secluded corner, right under the foot of a massive Roman column, was Ben Sterling. At only 6 years old, Ben looked tiny in clothes that were far too formal for his age. In his right hand was a half-eaten pink frosted donut. But what lay on his lap was the strange part, a thick stack of case files, the edges worn, filled with dense, dry lines of legal text. Ben didn't read like a normal person. His eyes didn't blink, sweeping across each line with the speed of an electronic scanner. Page 14. Memorized. Page 15. Memorized. His 190 IQ brain was devouring data, analyzing every smallest contradiction while his mouth continued chewing the sweet pastry. Bang! A strong collision startled the entire hallway. Mark Thornton, with the arrogance of someone who never looks down, had tripped over Ben's foot. The case file flew out of Ben's hands. But the true disaster was the donut. It fell to the floor, and immediately, Mark's filthy size 45 boot stomped it flat. Pink icing burst everywhere, smearing the polished leather of his dress shoe. Silence fell. Ben looked up. There was no fear in the boy's eyes, only the calm stillness of a deep lake. Mark leaned down, his face flushed red with anger. He growled, spit flying onto Ben's face. "Are you blind, you little brat? Do you know how much these shoes cost, huh? Rainbow." Instead of apologizing or crying, Ben glanced at the crushed donut on the floor, then back at Mark. The boy calmly took a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped the frosting off his cheek, and spoke in an even, emotionless voice. "You were walking on the left side of the hallway, the area designated for low-speed pedestrian traffic according to court regulations. I was sitting 30 centimeters from the wall, completely within the safety zone. Physically speaking, you collided with me." Mark froze for a second, unable to believe what he just heard. A 6-year-old lecturing him? His anger surged even hotter. He kicked the remaining piece of donut against the wall. "Trash!" Mark shouted, jabbing a thick finger at Ben's face. "You dirty my shoes and then argue. Get back to preschool before I throw you out on the street with the other homeless rats." Then he roughly bent down and snatched up the file that had flown from Ben's hands. "And what's this?" he sneered, flipping the cover. "Case file 734B. This is confidential police material. Where'd you steal it? I'm confiscating it." He didn't know that the moment he grabbed that file, Ben had already memorized the last line on page 42, a tiny detail, a fatal mistake that Mark himself had accidentally left in the report. Ben stood up. He straightened his shirt collar, brushed the dust off his pants. He stood tall even though he only reached Mark's waist. His presence sent a chill down people's spines. "Officer, your name is Mark Thornton, badge number 8920. Ben said, his voice icy, his gaze locked on the nameplate on Mark's chest. Mark smirked mockingly. "So what, kid? You gonna tell your mommy?" Ben shook his head slightly. His gaze sharp as a scalpel. Article 5, Public Service Law and Code of Conduct of the U.S. Police Department. Officers who threaten or verbally abuse minors in public are subject to Level 3 disciplinary review. Your behavior is a serious violation of ethical standards. The boy paused, pointing at the smear of frosting on the floor. "You owe me an apology. And a new donut." The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath at the courage or insanity of this child. Mark burst out laughing, his laughter echoing with contempt. He leaned close to Ben's face, whispering threateningly. "Listen, you little genius freak. I am the law here. I don't owe you anything. Now get lost." He turned his back and walked away, case file in hand, striding toward courtroom 1, leaving Ben standing alone in the cold hallway. Mark Thornton believed he had taught a spoiled child a lesson. He had no idea he had just tipped over the first domino in a chain of events that would bury his career. Ben watched the large figure walk away. He didn't cry, didn't get angry. He simply sighed, looking regretfully at the frosting on the floor, and murmured to himself, "Waste of food. And a waste of a career." Ben turned and walked toward the secret side door leading into the courtroom, where Judge Eleanor Vaughn was waiting. Courtroom 1 of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York exuded an oppressive solemnity, with glossy black oak panels and a soaring high ceiling. The air inside was thick, heavy, disturbed only by the loud, self-satisfied voice of Officer Mark Thornton. He stood on the witness stand, chest puffed out, hand gripping the railing as if he were crushing the truth in his palm. Across from him, inside the glass defendant's box, sat John Doe, a thin, trembling homeless man huddled in an oversized torn coat. His head was lowered, shoulders shaking, like a wounded animal awaiting a mercy shot. Mark pointed straight at John Doe, his voice booming across the chamber. "Your Honor, this case is simple as daylight. He is a parasite of society, a sneaky sewer rat. I personally saw him stick that filthy hand into a car and snatch a Rolex worth $65,000. He has no job, no home, and most importantly no dignity to resist temptation." He paused to catch his breath, glanced at John Doe with utter contempt, then turned to Judge Eleanor Vaughn with a triumphant smile. "Your Honor, I request the maximum sentence as an example. We can't allow people like him to stain the streets of New York for even one more day." Judge Eleanor Vaughn, a woman with snow-white hair in a tight bun and sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses, sat motionless on the towering bench. She didn't look at Mark, nor at John Doe. She was studying a small note on her desk, tapping it lightly with a calculating finger. The prolonged silence made Mark uneasy. He cleared his throat. "Judge Vaughn. The material evidence is clear. I am the direct witness. Can we proceed with sentencing?" Suddenly, the gavel struck sharply. Thud. Judge Vaughn lifted her head. Her eyes held none of the agreement Mark expected. She spoke in a cold, decisive voice. "Officer Thornton, your enthusiasm is noted. However, the U.S. District Court does not operate on haste. This case, based on my preliminary assessment, contains logical contradictions of a particularly complex nature that an ordinary mind might overlook." Mark frowned, confusion beginning to creep into his mind. "Complicated?" "Your Honor, I don't understand." I caught him red-handed. "What could possibly be complicated here?" Judge Vaughn smiled. "That is exactly why," she continued, her voice echoing across the courtroom, "I have activated the Federal Special Justice Act, Section 19. I have invited an independent advisor from the Federal Advisory Council to take part in adjudicating this case. A pure intellect, untainted by prejudice." The entire courtroom stirred. Reporters stretched their necks. The public defender assigned to John Doe looked baffled. An advisor from the Federal Advisory Council? Those were usually elderly law professors or erudite lords. "Invite the advisor in," Judge Vaughn ordered. The heavy mahogany side door next to the judge's bench slowly opened. Every gaze in the room shifted toward it. Mark held his breath, bracing himself to face some dignified expert. But no one was at adult eye level. The doorway was empty. Then, from below, a small, soft footstep sounded. Entering the courtroom was not a white-haired old man, but a boy. Ben Sterling. The boy was still wearing the overly neat outfit he had on in the hallway, but now he had on a tiny black robe tailored just for him, long enough to brush the floor. His face was expressionless, showing no fear at the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. The courtroom gasped in shock. Whispers rose like a hive bursting open. "What the hell is this?" Mark blurted, eyes bulging as if they might pop out. "A kid? Judge, are you kidding me? This is a court, not a daycare." Judge Vaughn struck her gavel harder. "Order. Officer Thornton, mind your words. This is Advisor Ben Sterling, a prodigy with an IQ of 190 who has memorized every legal code in history. He has been granted special privileges by the President of the United States to participate in the Junior Judicial Council, a top-secret experimental project to use the pure logic of children to adjudicate deadlocked cases. Ben said nothing. The boy calmly walked to the towering chair placed beside Judge Vaughn's seat. He had to tiptoe and grab the armrest to climb up with difficulty. Once seated, he looked tiny against the court's solemn grandeur, but the weight of his stare on Mark felt like 1,000 pounds. Mark froze. He recognized this kid. The worst nightmare of his life had just materialized in flesh and blood. He stuttered, face drained of color. It's you. Ben Sterling slowly picked up a tiny wooden gavel crafted just for him. He tapped it lightly but decisively on the desk. Toke. That small sound had more impact than any shout Mark could muster. Ben adjusted the microphone. His childish but steely voice echoed across the courtroom speakers. The trial begins. And the boy paused, tilting his head and staring straight at the large trembling officer, the corner of his mouth lifting in a sly half-smile. And by the way, according to my calculations, Officer Thornton, you still owe me a donut. But we'll settle that later. 1. Mark Thornton felt his chest tighten. He looked around for help, but found only Judge Vaughn's cold eyes and the crowd's curiosity. Officer Mark Thornton took a deep breath, forcing the image of the child on the high chair out of his mind. He was a seasoned cop, a predator. He couldn't let a kid still smelling of milk shake him. He straightened his tie, turned to Judge Eleanor, deliberately ignoring Ben. Your Honor, let's skip this ridiculous show, Mark said, his voice sharpening as he tried to regain his usual authority. The truth is unchanging. At exactly 9 p.m. last night, at the intersection of 5th Avenue, I was on patrol. I personally saw the defendant John Doe sneaking up to a Mercedes parked along the street. He paused, glaring at John Doe threateningly before continuing. He used a metal bar to pry the car door open. Under the bright streetlights, I saw every one of his actions clearly. He reached in, took the Rolex, and stuffed it into that filthy coat pocket. I moved in immediately. The courtroom fell silent. Mark's testimony was clear, detailed, and highly convincing. Judge Eleanor nodded slightly, jotting notes into her notebook. It seemed Mark had regained the upper hand. But the rustling of papers from the advisor's chair shattered the atmosphere. Ben Sterling wasn't looking at Mark. The boy was flipping through a thin pale blue file he had pulled from the enormous stack he brought. His eyes skimmed numbers, then stopped. He clicked his tongue, tisk-a-tisk, echoing clearly through the microphone. Officer Thornton, Ben said, his voice clear but cold as ice. You just confirmed that you saw the incident under bright streetlights at 9 p.m., correct? Mark snapped back toward him, eyes blazing. That's right, kid. My memory is better than that tiny head of yours. The streetlights on 5th Avenue are very bright. I saw his face clearly. Ben nodded slowly, as if confirming a diagnosis of a terminal illness. He pulled out a sheet stamped with a bright red seal and held it up for the courtroom to see. Very strange, Ben said, tilting his head with exaggerated curiosity. Officer, do you have owl vision? Or perhaps you possess night vision powers the police department hasn't updated in your personnel file. Mark frowned, unease creeping up his spine. What the hell are you talking about? This is emergency report. No. 402Z from Con Edison, New York and the National Weather Service, Ben read aloud, his tiny finger pointing at the bolded line. Last night, a localized storm with winds up to level 7 hit northern New York. It caused a malfunction at the central power station. Ben paused, letting the information settle before delivering the blow. The entire streetlight system and residential electricity on 5th Avenue went completely out from 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. The measured brightness at the scene at that time was 0.1 lumen, meaning pitch black. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, let alone a tiny Rolex from 20 meters away. The courtroom erupted in shock. Murmurs exploded like bees swarming. Judge Eleanor stopped writing, pushed her glasses up, and stared at Mark with razor-sharp eyes. Officer Thornton? She asked, her voice dropping dangerously. How do you explain the discrepancy between bright streetlights and pitch-black darkness? Mark froze. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, slipping under his tight collar. He felt the floor giving way under him. He was far too used to fabricating evidence in small cases no one cared about, but he never expected to run into a living lie detector machine like this kid. Mark stammered, eyes darting desperately. Maybe I misremembered the time a little. Or maybe. Ben didn't let him catch his breath. The boy rested his chin on his hand, smiling the smile of a hunter who has just seen his prey fall into the trap. Officer, 1 second ago you insisted your memory was better than mine, Ben gently reminded him. Now you're saying it was a mistake? Or, are you trying to improvise a new script? Panic flared in Mark's eyes. He knew he couldn't admit he had lied. He had to make something up right now. Flashlight. Mark shouted, his voice cracking from panic. Right. I mixed up the detail about the streetlights. Actually, I used a flashlight. I'm a cop, I always carry my duty flashlight. I shined it on him. Yes. The flashlight. He exhaled, believing he had narrowly escaped disaster. Ben Sterling said nothing. He simply lowered the electrical report and slowly pulled out another sheet of paper, a hand-drawn map, messy but detailed down to the very millimeter. A glint of cruel amusement flashed in the boy's eyes. Mark had just dug his own grave even deeper, and Ben was already holding the shovel. A flashlight, huh? Ben whispered into the microphone, just loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. An interesting choice. But unfortunately, Officer Thornton, physics and geography don't agree with you. Physics and geography. Mark repeated, his voice cracking, sounding like metal scraping. He felt himself being cornered, and his survival instinct surged stronger than ever. He knew a small handheld flashlight couldn't possibly convince the court that he had seen an object as small as a Rolex from 20 meters away on a pitch-black night. He needed a stronger source of light. A source no one could deny. Mark slammed his hand against the witness rail, trying to regain control through sheer volume. Wait. I misspoke because I was upset by his disrespectful attitude. Not a flashlight. It was the car's headlights. Yes, I was sitting in the patrol car. I turned on the high beams. It was bright as day. Nothing could hide from that light. I saw him, the car, and the watch. Clear as crystal. He exhaled, chest heaving. He believed this time he had blocked every counterargument. Police car headlights were powerful tools and, more importantly, no one could verify their brightness at that moment. Are you certain, Officer Thornton? Ben asked again, his voice so gentle it felt dangerous. You are affirming under oath that you drove your Ford Interceptor patrol car onto 5th Avenue at 9 p.m. and used your headlights to illuminate the scene. 100% certain. Mark roared, eyes blazing. Ben Sterling didn't flinch. The boy simply nodded, set down the meteorological report, and lifted the hand-drawn sheet he had prepared. It was a map drawn in pencil childlike lines, yet detailed down to every turn, every alley, with notes marked at astonishingly precise proportions. Your Honor, Ben said, turning the sheet toward Eleanor Vaughn before facing Mark again. This is the real-time traffic map of North New York, updated in my memory this morning. He took a red pen from his pocket and circled a large area on the map 5th Avenue. Officer Thornton, Ben said, his gaze sharpening like a laser, it appears you were too busy arresting an innocent man to keep up with public works updates. 5th Avenue is currently part of underground water pipeline replacement project, No. 112. Mark froze. A chilling sensation shot down his spine. Ben continued, his voice steady but each word sounding like a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of Mark's career. A full street closure was issued at 8 a.m. yesterday. Both ends of 5th Avenue were blocked by concrete barriers and a 2-meter deep excavation trench for construction. It is a dead-end one-way street, and at 9 p.m. last night, it was completely closed to all motor vehicles. The courtroom went dead silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the finishing blow. Ben looked directly at Mark, tilting his head with feigned innocence. So, Officer Thornton, unless your patrol car can fly or pass through reinforced concrete, how exactly did you drive in and shine your headlights as you just swore? What? Mark stuttered, his face shifting from red to ghost white. He looked around, desperate for rescue, but no one dared look him in the eye. Ben didn't stop. He delivered another logical strike. If your car couldn't enter, that means you walked in. If you walked in, that means there were no headlights. If there were no headlights and the streetlights were out, then you were standing in total darkness. Ben tapped the gavel lightly on the desk, the sound dry and final. Conclusion, you saw nothing. Your entire testimony about seeing the defendant steal the watch is a product of your imagination, or worse, a deliberate fabrication. How? What? How? Objection. Mark screamed in desperation, but his voice trembled and faltered. The map. The map could be wrong. A child drew that map. Judge Eleanor Vaughn pushed her glasses up and looked at Mark with blazing fury. She picked up the internal phone and spoke curtly. Court clerk, verify the construction status on 5th Avenue last night with the Department of Transportation. Less than a minute later, the clerk returned and nodded. Your Honor, 5th Avenue was completely blocked off since yesterday. No vehicles could enter or exit. Mark Thornton collapsed. He clung to the witness rail to keep from falling. He could feel hundreds of eyes in the courtroom staring at him not with fear or respect, but with contempt and disgust. Murmurs grew louder. Words like, liar, dirty cop, began to ripple through the gallery. Ben Sterling sat on the high chair, observing Mark's collapse with a disturbing calm. But he knew exposing the lie was only the first step. To save John Doe, he needed more than logic. He needed a voice from someone who could not speak. Your Honor, Ben spoke up, cutting through the chaos. Officer Thornton has run out of excuses. Now it's time we hear the truth from the only person present at the scene who hasn't been allowed to speak. He pointed toward the glass enclosure where John Doe was curled up. Mark lifted his head, clinging to his last scrap of hope, laughing bitterly through his panic. Hear him? He's mute. He's a mentally deficient idiot. He can't say anything. Ben hopped down from the judge's chair, the black robe billowing lightly behind him. You're wrong again, officer, Ben said as he walked toward the defendant. No one is incapable of speaking. You simply never bothered to listen. Officer Mark Thornton, though standing at the brink of collapse, clung desperately to the last life raft he had. The victim's silence. He watched the small figure of Ben walking toward the defendant's glass box, then burst out laughing, a strained, dry, mocking laugh tinged with hopelessness. Your Honor, do we really have to watch this performance? Mark shouted, pointing at the trembling John Doe. Look at him. He's mute. He's mentally deficient. He's a soulless shell. He doesn't even know where he is. How could he possibly testify? He turned to Judge Eleanor, his voice full of contempt. Questioning him is useless. He has no cognitive ability. He's just a piece of trash from society. John Doe, hearing the noise but not understanding the words, could only hold his head, his cloudy eyes overflowing with fear. He looked around like an animal cornered against a wall, bracing for the blow. Ben Sterling completely ignored Mark's insults. The boy stopped in front of the glass partition. He didn't look at John with pity, but with equal respect. Ben took a deep breath, then slowly raised his tiny hands. The entire courtroom held its breath. Ben's fingers began to move. Agile. Decisive. Fluid. He was using sign language. Are you okay? What is your name? Ben signed. John Doe froze. His eyes widened, staring at the child's fingers. For the first time in years living at the bottom of society, someone was speaking his language. Someone was trying to understand him. John's cracked lips trembled. Tears spilled from his hollow eyes. His calloused, dark hands trembled as he raised them and began signing back. I'm scared. I'm John. I didn't steal. Ben nodded, turning to Judge Eleanor, his voice clear as he served as the interpreter for a silenced man. Your Honor, the defendant is not cognitively impaired as Officer Thornton insulted. He is congenitally deaf and mute. His name is John. And he states he is innocent. Mark roared. He's making it up. How does the court know this brat isn't just performing? Judge Eleanor slammed her gavel, her eyes blazing. The court clerk has a level 2 sign language certificate. She is verifying every gesture. Silence immediately. Officer Thornton. Ben turned back to John and signed again. Tell me what happened last night. Why was your hand near his coat pocket? John Doe inhaled, his hands moving through the air, describing what happened with pain and injustice etched on his face. Ben watched carefully, then faced the crowd, his voice tightening. Mr. John says that last night, he was lying asleep on the corner of the street when Officer Thornton walked over, looking very rushed and angry. Mr. Thornton tripped over Mr. John's leg and fell forward. When he stood up and kicked Mr. John, a piece of paper fell out of his chest pocket. Ben pointed at Mark. Mr. John did not reach into his pocket to steal a watch. He picked up that paper to return it to him. But you grabbed him, shoved the watch into his pocket, and falsely accused him of theft. Mendax. Liar. Mark screamed, his face burning red. There was no paper. I didn't drop anything. He's lying. Ben gave a cold smile. He walked to the evidence table, where the random items taken from John Doe during the arrest were kept. Mixed among the trash was a crumpled, mud-stained scrap of paper. Officer Thornton, Ben lifted the paper with tweezers and held it under the light. You were too arrogant. When you arrested Mr. John, you treated everything on him as trash and dumped it into the evidence bag without checking. You thought this was his trash. No. Ben unfolded the paper. Despite the wrinkles, the printed black letters were still readable. Your Honor, Ben said, his voice ringing with menace. This is not garbage. This is a pawn shop receipt from Gold and Cash in East New York, printed at 8:15 p.m. last night, just 45 minutes before this incident occurred. Ben turned to Mark, his eyes like blades piercing through him. And do you know the most interesting part? The person who pawned the item was not Mark Thornton. But the pawned item was a 2-carat ruby ring, the main piece of evidence in case 734B, the very case you are in charge of investigating. The entire courtroom went silent. Ben had remembered. It was from the file he read in the hallway earlier, the file Mark had snatched back. Ben had memorized the list of missing evidence. You embezzled evidence from another case, pawned it for cash, and accidentally dropped the receipt when you assaulted Mr. John, Ben concluded, his voice icy. Mr. John is not the thief. You are the thief, Officer Thornton. Mark staggered backward, bumping into the lawyer's table. His mouth opened but no sound came out. His darkest secret, the one he thought buried forever, had just been exposed by a 6-year-old child using a scrap of discarded paper. But Ben wasn't done with him. That proves corruption, Ben said, placing the receipt down and picking up the Rolex evidence. Now I'll prove you framed him with something much sweeter. Officer Mark Thornton swayed like a boxer hit with a stunning uppercut. The pawn receipt exposing evidence theft had ripped off his mask of integrity. But the survival instinct of a wounded predator made him thrash even harder. He knew corruption could cost him his job, but framing an innocent man was what would throw him behind bars. That was a mistake. Mark screamed, veins bulging, sweat pouring down his temples. He jabbed a finger at the pawn receipt in Ben's hand. Fine. I admit I pawned the ring because I was desperate. But that has nothing to do with this case. That bum John Doe is still the watch thief. They're two separate things. You're twisting the facts. He turned to Judge Eleanor, his voice hoarse but filled with pleading. Your Honor, my wrongdoing in another case does not make John Doe innocent in this one. The Rolex was found in his pocket. That's an undeniable fact. He could be a victim of me tripping and still be the thief. Don't let this kid manipulate you. Judge Eleanor frowned. Legally speaking, Mark had one technically correct point. One crime did not automatically erase another. She looked at Ben, waiting. Ben Sterling was not flustered. The boy set the receipt down, then picked up the sealed evidence bag containing the $65,000 Rolex. He studied the watch glimmering behind the plastic, then looked at Mark with pity. The pity one gives an idiot trying to solve quantum physics. "You're right, Officer Thornton," Ben said, his voice frighteningly calm. "Evidence is king. This watch is the key. And it is screaming the truth. You're just too deaf to hear it." Ben turned to the bailiff nearby. "Sir, please turn off the courtroom lights and bring me a forensic UV lamp." "Objection!" Mark shouted, panicking. What kind of magic trick is he trying now? Overruled. Judge Eleanor ordered immediately. Lights off. The courtroom plunged into darkness. A tense silence fell. Only the eerie blue glow from the UV lamp in Ben's hand remained. Ben shined the purple beam onto the Rolex. "Look closely," Ben's voice echoed in the darkness, bouncing off the cold stone walls. Under the UV light, on the sapphire crystal and metal band of the Rolex, a glowing green thumbprint appeared, faint but unmistakable. It was big, clear, and positioned right at the clasp. "A perfect fingerprint," Ben whispered. "But this is not an ordinary fingerprint. It's glowing." "Officer Thornton, do you know why it glows?" Mark froze in the darkness, his breathing ragged. Ben continued analyzing, his voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel cutting open a corpse. "This is the fluorescent reaction of lipid and crystallized sucrose, or in other words, animal fat and artificial sugar. A very distinctive mixture." The courtroom lights flicked back on. Ben turned off the UV lamp and looked straight into Mark's face. "Officer Thornton, do you remember the accident in the hallway earlier? When you crushed my donut, the cream and grease splattered everywhere. When you bent down to snatch the case file out of my hand, your right hand wiped across that smear on the floor, or on your own shoe." Ben pointed at Mark's right hand where a faint sticky stain still clung, something he hadn't had time to clean off in his rush into the courtroom. "This watch is covered in those same sweet fingerprints. This proves one single thing in terms of timing. You handled the watch after the collision with me in the hallway." Ben turned to John Doe, his voice dropping into something deep and full of feeling. "And Mr. John? He has been starved for 3 days. His stomach is empty. On his hands, there is only dirt and despair, not a grain of sugar, or a drop of fat. How could he possibly leave donut grease fingerprints on the watch if he took it from the car?" The courtroom erupted. Gasps of shock burst through the room. Ben's logic was as tight as an iron cage, locking Mark inside with no escape. Mark Thornton staggered backward, bumping into his chair. He looked down at his hand, then at the watch. He realized that his own arrogance and bullying in the hallway had become his death sentence here in court. Conclusion: Ben struck the gavel hard, the sound like thunder exploding in Mark's ears. "You took the watch beforehand. You kept it in your pocket. After colliding with me, your hand covered in grease, you used that filthy hand to pull the watch out and plant it on Mr. John to fabricate the seam." "No. Impossible," Mark whispered, his voice cracking apart. I'm the best cop. I can't lose to a kid." Ben stood up on the high chair, his tiny finger pointing straight at the collapsing giant. "You didn't lose to me, officer. You lost to the truth. And the truth always has a sweet flavor." Judge Eleanor Vaughn shot to her feet, her face tightening with fury and authority. "Judicial police. Arrest Mark Thornton immediately. Charges: perjury, evidence tampering, false accusation, and embezzlement of public property." 2 large court officers rushed forward at once. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed clack, locking Mark's hands behind his back. The arrogant cop who had walked into the courtroom like a king was now being dragged out like a vile criminal. He screamed helplessly, but no one listened anymore. From inside the glass box, John Doe looked at Ben through tears. He lifted his thumb, signaling, "Thank you." Ben smiled, nodding slightly. But the trial wasn't over. Ben knew that punishing Mark with prison was too easy. The boy flipped to the final page inside his superhuman memory. The atmosphere inside the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York was more chaotic than ever. The two judicial officers were dragging Mark Thornton toward the back door to throw him into a holding cell for criminal processing. The clattering of handcuffs mixed with the desperate screams of the disgraced officer. "Let me go. I've served the force for 20 years. This is a mistake. I want a lawyer." Judge Eleanor Vaughn signed the detention order, her face stiff and unforgiving. To her, justice had been done. The bad man jailed, the innocent man cleared. But just as the tip of her pen touched the paper, a sharp gavel strike stopped everything. Bang! Ben Sterling had climbed back onto the towering chair. He stood tall, hands on his hips, looking down at the chaos below with a strange authority. "Stop!" Ben commanded, his young voice carrying an undeniable order. "Who said he's going to prison?" The entire courtroom froze. Mark Thornton stopped struggling and looked up with a flicker of fragile hope. Judge Eleanor lowered her pen and turned toward the child prodigy beside her in confusion. "Advisor Sterling. He has committed serious crimes. Under criminal procedure, he must be stripped of his badge and serve at least 7 years in prison. Do you have a different opinion?" Ben shook his head, his expression wrinkling as if he had just smelled something unpleasant. 7 years in prison? Your Honor, Grand Godmother. I mean, Judge Vaughn. That is a massive waste of resources. The boy reached into the pocket on his chest and took out a tiny notebook, flipped a few pages, then read aloud. According to this year's financial report, the cost of keeping one inmate at Rikers Island Jail is $56,700 per year. Taxpayers' money. Money from workers like Mr. John here, if he were able to work. Why should we force the public to pay to feed and house the person who harmed them? The whole courtroom fell absolutely silent. Ben's logic was too practical, too ruthless, yet too correct. "So, what do you propose?" Judge Eleanor asked, curious. Ben smiled a smile that made Mark Thornton shiver even more than hearing he was about to be arrested. "I propose reviving a forgotten legal precedent," Ben declared firmly. "The Dignity Restoration Clause under the Civil Responsibility Act." The lawyers below started whispering. That law allows the offender, instead of going to prison, to use his labor to directly serve the victim, in order to restore what he has destroyed, Ben explained briskly. The boy pointed his gavel toward Mark Thornton. "Officer Thornton, you're afraid of prison, aren't you? You're afraid of being locked up with the criminals you yourself put in there? They will tear you apart." Mark nodded frantically, his face utterly drained of color. "Yes. Yes. Please, don't send me to prison. I'll do anything. Anything." Ben nodded in satisfaction. "Good. The court rules, Mark Thornton is exempt from criminal incarceration." Mark exhaled sharply, nearly collapsing with relief. But he celebrated too soon. Instead, Ben continued, his voice icy, "You are stripped of all your ranks and the pension accumulated over the last 20 years. That money will be transferred directly into Mr. John Doe's account to rent a comfortable apartment. And your primary punishment is, for the next 10 years, you will become the personal assistant, housekeeper, and full-time caretaker of Mr. John Doe." The courtroom gasped. Mark's eyes rolled wide. "What? Me? Serve him?" Ben glared. "You will cook, wash clothes, clean the house, and take Mr. John on walks every day. You will learn sign language to communicate with him and serve all his daily needs. You trampled on his dignity, now you must use your own life to restore it." Ben turned to John Doe, who was now standing confused in the glass booth that had been unlocked. He signed. "Do you agree, Mr. John? He will be your hands, your feet, and your protector. But the power will be in your hands." Ben turned back to Mark, delivering the finishing blow. "And remember this well, former Officer Thornton. This is a suspended sentence with special conditions. If Mr. John complains even once about your attitude, or if you dare skip your duties, the pardon will be void immediately. Then you will go to prison not for 7 years, but for 20 years. Do you understand? 20 years. Mark looked at John Doe, the filthy man he had despised just an hour earlier. Now that man held the key to his life. He swallowed bitterly and bowed his head in shame. I understand. I accept. John Doe stepped out of the glass booth. He looked at Mark, bowing his head, then looked at Ben. A gentle, radiant smile spread across his weathered face. He signed, "Thank you." Judge Eleanor Vaughn struck the gavel one last time, the sound echoing like the closing of the most dramatic chapter in the history of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. The ruling is enforced. Court dismissed. Ben Sterling breathed a sigh of relief, taking off the cumbersome black robe. The boy jumped down from the chair and ran to hold Judge Eleanor's hand. "It's done," Ben said, his voice returning to a childish whine. "You promised." "This case was too hard. I want 3 scoops of chocolate ice cream." "Hey." Eleanor smiled, holding the tiny hand of the prodigy. "All right, Advisor Sterling. You deserve the whole ice cream shop." The two of them walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a Mark Thornton trudging after John Doe like a servant, beginning his 10-year sentence humiliating but just. The end. Ben spared the corrupt cop from prison, in exchange for forcing him to serve the victim for 10 years like a servant. What do you think about Ben's sentence? Team A, Ben did absolutely the right thing. Making him serve the victim is a humiliation and more practical punishment than wasting taxpayer money on prison. Team B, too disappointing. He's a dirty cop who nearly destroyed someone's life. He should rot in prison. That's real justice. Law isn't a game.